from a small island kingdom to ruling over a quarter of the world's population. The British Empire didn't just shape history, it reshaped borders, cultures, and daily life across continents. But beneath the grand tales of redcoats, steamships, and royal decrees lies a slower, dustier truth. How did people actually live, sleep, and survive in the far corners of an empire that claimed the sun never set? Tonight, we journey through the entire rise and quiet fall of the British Empire. One drowsy page at a time. Can't sleep? You're not alone. Let this calming historical ride guide you into rest, one empire at a time. Subscribe and hit the bell icon, Dust, for more sleepy stories that make history feel like a warm bedtime memory. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it for you? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. You are sitting in a cramped office in Leadenhall Street, London. In the year 1780, the morning fog drifts through the narrow windows of East India House, and around you, the soft scratch of quill pens fills the air like a gentle rainfall. This is where an empire is actually built, not on battlefields or in grand palaces, but in these quiet rooms where clerks in ink-stained waistcoats methodically record every rupee, every bolt of cloth, every pound of tea that flows through the vast machinery of the East India Company. The East India Company began its existence in 1600 as something remarkably mundane, a joint stock company seeking profit from the spice trade. What transformed it into the ruler of vast territories was not military conquest alone, but something far more prosaic, an obsession with record-keeping that would make a modern accountant weep with joy. Every transaction, every correspondence, every minor administrative decision was documented, filed, and cross-referenced in a system so comprehensive that it effectively created a paper-based government. Spanning continents, the foundation of this administrative empire was the factory system, and here, factory meant something entirely different from the industrial buildings you might imagine. These were trading posts, but more importantly, there were administrative centers where agents called factors conducted the daily business of empire. When company ships returned to Europe laden with Asian goods, these factors remained behind. And their primary job was not just to negotiate with local merchants, but to maintain meticulous records of every aspect of their operations. Consider the daily routine of a factor in Madras or Bombay in the mid-18th century. His day began before dawn, not with dramatic decisions about territorial expansion, but with the careful examination of account books from the previous day. Every purchase of cotton, every sale of British woolens, every payment to local officials had to be recorded in duplicate, one copy for the local records, another to be sent on the next ship to London. The factor would spend hours each morning reconciling these accounts, ensuring that not a single rupee was unaccounted for. This obsession with documentation extended far beyond simple commercial transactions. The company's factors were required to maintain detailed reports on local political conditions, weather patterns, crop yields, and the activities of rival European trading companies. These reports, written in careful script on expensive paper, imported from England, created an information network that spanned from London to Canton, from Bombay to Batavia. Every 6 months, a comprehensive packet of correspondence would be dispatched to East India House, containing hundreds of documents that would be carefully filed, indexed, and cross-referenced by an army of clerks. The Court of Directors in London 1T4. Elected members who governed this vast enterprise spent their days not in plotting grand strategic moves, but in reading through these reports with the dedication of medieval monks studying scripture. Every Tuesday and Thursday, they would gather in their meeting room in Leadenhall Street, surrounded by towers of correspondence from their far-flung factories. The agenda for these meetings reads like the most boring document imaginable: reports on the condition of warehouses in Bengal, disputes over the quality of mocha coffee, complaints about the shortage of suitable clerks in Madras. Yet it was precisely this attention to mundane detail that allowed the company to function across such vast distances in an age when communication took months. The standardized forms, the duplicate records, the careful indexing system, all of this bureaucratic machinery enabled a small group of men in London to maintain control over commercial operations stretching from the Red Sea to the South China Sea. When a factor in Surat purchased a consignment of cotton, the transaction was recorded on form number 47A, with copies filed under cotton purchases, Surat factory accounts, and monthly commercial summary. This seemingly tedious process meant that 6 months later, when the ship arrived in London, the directors knew exactly what cargo to expect and could plan their sales accordingly. The transformation from trading company to territorial ruler began with the same bureaucratic precision. When Robert Clive's victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757 brought Bengal under company control, the immediate response was not military triumph, but administrative panic. How does one govern a territory the size of France with a system designed for counting bales of silk? The answer lay in expanding the same bureaucratic methods that had made the company's commercial operations so efficient. The company's clerks immediately set to work creating new forms, new filing systems, new categories of correspondence. Revenue collection required Form 23B, judicial proceedings needed Form 31C, and military expenses demanded Form 18F. Within months of taking control of Bengal, the company had established an administrative system based entirely on paperwork. Government of forms and ledgers that would become the foundation of British rule in India. This bureaucratic revolution was conducted by men whose names history has largely forgotten, junior clerks who arrived in India as teenagers and spent their entire careers perfecting systems of record-keeping that would govern millions of people. They were not heroes in any conventional sense, but their patient work with account books and correspondence files created the administrative infrastructure that would support the British Empire for the next 2 centuries. But as these clerks worked late into the tropical nights, copying documents by candlelight and reconciling accounts that stretched across oceans, a troubling question began to emerge. The company's correspondence with London was taking longer to process. The files were growing thicker, and the simple commercial operations that had once been managed from a single office in Leadenhall Street were becoming increasingly complex. How long could this system of paper-based administration continue to expand before it collapsed under its own weight? By 1784, the clerks in East India House were drowning in paper. The morning delivery of dispatches from India now required 2 carts instead of 1, and the filing cabinets that had once comfortably held a few years' worth of correspondence now filled entire floors of the building. What had begun as a simple system for tracking commercial transactions had evolved into something unprecedented in human history. Bureaucratic machine capable of governing territories containing over 100 million people through nothing but carefully maintained records and standardized procedures. The transformation was most visible in the company's London headquarters, where the original 24-member court of directors now presided over a bureaucratic labyrinth that employed hundreds of clerks, each specializing in particular aspects of the company's operations. The India correspondence was handled by one department, China affairs by another, military matters by a third. Each department maintained its own filing system, its own forms, its own procedures, creating a web of bureaucratic complexity that no single person could fully comprehend. The daily routine of these clerks had evolved into something resembling a monastic discipline. They arrived at East India House at precisely 8 o'clock each morning, hung their coats on numbered pegs in the hallway, and took their places at desks arranged in long rows like pews in a cathedral. The senior clerk would distribute the day's correspondence letters from Calcutta requesting permission to repair a bridge, reports from Madras detailing the collection of land revenue, complaints from Bombay about the behavior of local officials. Each document had to be read, summarized, cross-referenced with previous correspondence, and either approved, rejected, or referred to a higher authority. This process of bureaucratic digestion was extraordinarily thorough, but painfully slow. A simple request to transfer a junior official from one post to another might require consultation with 6 different departments. Review of the individual's service record, verification of his accounts, and approval from multiple levels of authority. The file for such a transfer would grow to hundreds of pages, filled with correspondence, memoranda, and cross-references to other files. By the time a decision was finally reached, months or even years might have passed, and the original circumstances that prompted the request might have changed completely. Yet it was precisely this deliberate, methodical approach that allowed the company to maintain control over its vast territories. Every decision was documented. Every action was justified by reference to established precedent. Every expenditure was accounted for down to the last penny. The result was a system of governance that was almost impossible to challenge or circumvent, because it was particularly efficient, but because it was so thoroughly documented that any alternative approach seemed reckless by comparison. The bureaucratic expansion was most dramatic in India, where the company's transformation from trader to ruler required the creation of an entirely new administrative apparatus. The collection of land revenue alone required the establishment of hundreds of local offices, each staffed by company employees who had to maintain detailed records of crop yields, tax payments, and land ownership disputes. These records were compiled into district summaries, which were forwarded to provincial headquarters, which in turn submitted comprehensive reports to the Governor-General in Calcutta, who forwarded copies to London for review by the Court of Directors, the Diwani, the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, granted by the Mughal Emperor in 1765, had seemed like a straightforward commercial concession at the time. In practice, it required the company to develop systems for assessing agricultural productivity, mediating property disputes, and managing the complex relationships between landlords, tenants, and revenue collectors that had evolved over centuries. Every village in Bengal had to be surveyed, every field measured, every transaction recorded in the company's files. The men responsible for this monumental task were, for the most part, young Britons who had arrived in India with no training in administration and only the vaguest understanding of local conditions. They learned their craft through trial and error, guided by thick volumes of regulations and procedures that had been developed by their predecessors. The Cornwallis Code, implemented in the 1790s, ran to over 800 pages and covered everything from the proper forms for recording land sales to the correct procedures for conducting criminal trials. This obsession with procedure created its own momentum. As the company's territories expanded, new regulations were constantly being added to address previously unforeseen situations. A dispute over water rights in a Bengali village might result in a 20-page regulation governing similar cases. Throughout the subcontinent, a problem with corrupt officials in Madras might lead to new accounting procedures that were applied in Bombay and Calcutta as well. The regulatory framework grew steadily more complex, more detailed, more comprehensive, and more difficult for any individual to fully understand. The transformation was perhaps most evident in the career of Warren Hastings, the company's Governor-General. From 1773 to 1785, Hastings had joined the company as a young clerk in Bengal, and his rise through the ranks was marked not by military victories or diplomatic triumphs, but by his mastery of the company's administrative systems. He could navigate the bureaucratic maze of forms and procedures with extraordinary skill, finding precedents for controversial decisions and justifying his actions through careful reference to established regulations. Yet, even Hastings, despite his bureaucratic expertise, found himself increasingly constrained by the very system he had helped to perfect. Decisions that once might have been made quickly and informally now required extensive consultation, detailed justification, and approval from multiple authorities. The company's administration had become so complex and proceduralized that it was beginning to govern itself, following its own internal logic rather than responding to external circumstances. The establishment of the Board of Control in 1784 represented Parliament's attempt to impose some order on this bureaucratic leviathan. The board was designed to supervise the company's political and administrative affairs while leaving commercial operations in the hands of the directors. In practice, this created yet another layer of bureaucracy, as every major decision now required approval from both the company's court of directors and the government's board of control. The correspondence between these two bodies filled entire rooms in both Leadenhall Street and Whitehall. Each organization maintained its own staff of clerks, its own filing systems, its own procedures for handling correspondence. A single decision might generate dozens of letters, memoranda, and reports, as the two bureaucracies negotiated their respective spheres of authority. The result was a system of dual control that was extraordinarily thorough, but almost paralyzingly slow as the 18th century drew to a close. Thoughtful observers began to wonder whether the company's bureaucratic machine had grown beyond human control. The files were expanding exponentially. The procedures were becoming increasingly complex, and the time required to make even simple decisions was growing longer each year. Could this system continue to expand indefinitely, or would it eventually collapse under the weight of its own documentation? The collapse, when it came, was not the dramatic failure that contemporary observers might have expected. There were no filing cabinets bursting their seams, no clerks overwhelmed by insurmountable piles of correspondence, no sudden breakdown of the administrative machine. Instead, the end of the East India Company's rule came through the same methodical, bureaucratic process that had characterized its operations for over 2 centuries, carefully documented transfer of authority from one set of administrators to another, complete with proper forms, official seals, and detailed inventories of every piece of paper in every file. The Indian Mutiny of 1857-1859 provided the immediate catalyst for this transformation. But the underlying cause was the inherent contradiction that lay at the heart of the company's administrative system. The bureaucratic machine that had been designed to manage commercial operations had evolved into a system of territorial governance, but it remained fundamentally commercial in its outlook and procedures. Every aspect of administration was evaluated in terms of cost and profit. Every policy decision was justified by reference to commercial precedents. Every problem was addressed through the application of business methods to political questions. This approach had worked reasonably well as long as the company's territories were relatively small and its administrative responsibilities were limited. But by the 1850s, the company was governing over 200 million people across a subcontinent, and the commercial logic that had guided its operations for 2 centuries was increasingly inadequate to address the political, social, and military challenges it faced. The rebellion that erupted across northern India in 1857 was not primarily a response to bureaucratic inefficiency, but it revealed the fundamental weakness of the company's paper-based system of control. When Sepoys in Meerut refused to use the new Enfield rifle cartridges, the company's response was to initiate a correspondence with London, requesting guidance on the proper procedures for handling military insubordination. When the rebellion spread to Delhi and the aged Mughal emperor was proclaimed as the rebels' leader, the company's officials in Calcutta began drafting reports analyzing the legal implications of this development. While the company's clerks were busy documenting the crisis and requesting instructions from their superiors, the rebellion was spreading across the countryside with a speed that made bureaucratic responses obsolete. The carefully maintained communication networks that connected every district office to Calcutta and every provincial headquarters to London were disrupted by rebel forces who cared nothing for the sanctity of official correspondence. For the first time in decades, the company's administrators found themselves forced to make decisions without proper authorization. to act without adequate documentation, to respond to rapidly changing circumstances without the luxury of consulting. Their files, the experience was profoundly unsettling for men who had spent their entire careers within the structured world of bureaucratic procedure. Captain William Hodson, writing from Delhi during the siege, complained that he was being forced to make decisions that would normally require months of correspondence with Calcutta and London, company officials who had been trained to seek precedents for every action found themselves in situations for which no precedents existed. Forced to improvise solutions that violated every principle of their administrative training, the rebellion was eventually suppressed, but the crisis had exposed the limitations of the company's bureaucratic system in a way that could not be ignored. Parliament's investigation of the company's handling of the crisis focused not on military strategy or diplomatic failures, but on the administrative procedures that had delayed effective responses to the developing emergency. The Select Committee's report, running to over 1,500 pages, documented in excruciating detail the bureaucratic delays, the procedural confusion, and the administrative paralysis that had characterized the company's response to the rebellion. The Government of India Act of 1858 represented the formal end of the company's rule. But the transition was conducted with the same bureaucratic precision that had characterized the company's operations for over 2 centuries. Teams of clerks worked for months to transfer the company's files to the newly created India office, carefully cataloging every document, every precedent, every administrative procedure that would be inherited by the Crown's representatives in India. The India office itself was established as a government department in Whitehall, but its organization and procedures were modeled closely on those of the East India Company. The same forms were used, the same filing systems were maintained, the same bureaucratic routines were followed. The clerks who had previously served the company's court of directors now served the Secretary of State for India. But their daily work remained essentially unchanged, reading correspondence from India, drafting replies, maintaining files, and ensuring that every decision was properly documented and justified. This continuity was not accidental but deliberate. The bureaucratic system that the company had developed over 2 centuries was recognized as one of its most valuable assets, proven method for governing vast territories through careful attention to administrative detail. The Crown's assumption of direct rule in India did not represent a rejection of the company's administrative methods, but rather their adoption and refinement by a new set of masters. The final dissolution of the East India Company in 1874 was marked by the same attention to bureaucratic detail that had characterized its operations for nearly 3 centuries. The company's remaining assets were carefully inventoried, its final accounts were meticulously audited, and its shareholders were compensated according to a complex formula that took months to calculate. The last meeting of the Court of Directors was devoted not to nostalgic reminiscences about the company's glorious past, but to the approval of a detailed report on the proper procedures for transferring the company's remaining files to the appropriate government departments. The legacy of the East India Company's bureaucratic revolution extended far beyond India. The administrative methods that had been developed to manage the company's commercial operations became the foundation for colonial governance throughout the British Empire. The same forms, the same filing systems, the same procedural obsessions that had characterized the company's rule in India were exported to Africa, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Colonial administrators in Lagos and Hong Kong, in Singapore and Jamaica, followed procedures that had been perfected in the counting houses of Leadenhall Street and the district offices of Bengal. In the end, the East India Company's most enduring contribution to world history was not its commercial successes or its military victories, but its development of bureaucratic methods that made it possible to govern vast territories through the careful maintenance of written records. The clerks who had spent their careers copying letters, filing reports, and maintaining account books had created something unprecedented, a system of paper-based administration that could function across continents and survive changes in political leadership. Yet, questions remained about the ultimate implications of this bureaucratic revolution. If a small group of clerks, armed with nothing but ledger books and filing cabinets, could govern hundreds of millions of people, what did this say about the nature of political power in the modern world? And as the British Empire itself began to follow the company's bureaucratic example, establishing colonial offices and administrative departments modeled on the company's methods, would the same inexorable logic of paper-based control that had transformed a trading company into a territorial empire eventually transform the empire itself into something entirely different? In a modest building on Downing Street in 1825, 25 civil servants reported for work each morning to manage what would become the largest empire in human history. Their workplace was neither grand nor imposing a few cramped floors above. The Treasury offices, with narrow windows that admitted little light and heating that worked poorly in winter. Yet from these unremarkable rooms, a small group of clerks, registrars, and administrators would develop the bureaucratic systems that govern territories stretching from Canada to Australia. From India to the Caribbean, the Colonial Office, as established by Order in Council in 1825, was a marvel of administrative efficiency, though few contemporaries would have described it in such terms. The permanent staff consisted of a permanent under-secretary, 17 clerks, a counsel, a librarian and assistant librarian, a registrar and his assistant, a pro-sis writer, 2 office keepers, 2 porters, a housekeeper, and a private secretary. To the Secretary of State, when the position of chief clerk was abolished in 1833, the total establishment remained at approximately 25 officials, a number that would remain constant until 1850. These 25 individuals were responsible for the administrative oversight of territories that housed roughly 1/4 of the world's population and covered nearly 1/4 of its land surface. They accomplished this seemingly impossible task not through any form of magic or exceptional genius, but through the development of filing systems, correspondence, procedures, and bureaucratic routines so comprehensive and systematic that they could function almost automatically, requiring minimal human intervention once properly established. The foundation of this system was the departmental structure that divided the world into manageable administrative units. The General Department handled matters of broad imperial policy and coordination between territories. The North American Department managed Canada, Newfoundland, and the remaining British territories in the region. The West Indian Department oversaw the Caribbean colonies, from Jamaica and Barbados to the smaller island possessions. The Australian Department managed the growing settlements in New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land, and the emerging colonies on the continent. The African and Mediterranean Department handled the complex mix of trading posts, strategic bases, and emerging territories from Sierra Leone to Gibraltar. Each department was staffed by 2 or 3 clerks who became extraordinarily knowledgeable about their assigned territories. A junior clerk in the West Indian Department might spend his entire career processing correspondence related to sugar production, slave registration, and hurricane damage reports from Barbados and Jamaica. Over the decades, he would develop an encyclopedic knowledge of Caribbean affairs that no governor or colonial secretary could match. Simply by reading and filing thousands of letters, reports, and dispatches from the region, the daily routine of these clerks followed a pattern established in the 1820s and maintained with almost religious devotion for the following century. Each morning, the registry would distribute the previous day's incoming correspondence among the appropriate departments. A typical day's mail might include 50 to 75 letters from colonial governors, military commanders, and local officials scattered across the empire. Each letter had to be read, summarized, cross-referenced with previous correspondence, and either answered immediately or forwarded to the appropriate authority for decision. The process of handling a single piece of correspondence reveals the extraordinary thoroughness of the Colonial Office's administrative methods. When Governor Sir Charles Grey wrote from Jamaica in 1834 requesting permission to repair the harbor fortifications at Port Royal, his letter was first logged in the Registry's daily correspondence book, assigned a reference number, and forwarded to the West Indian Department. The clerk responsible for Jamaican military affairs would read the letter, consult the relevant files to determine the current state of the fortifications, the available budget for repairs, and any previous correspondence on the subject. He would then prepare a précis summarizing the governor's request and the relevant background information, which would be forwarded to the permanent undersecretary for review. If the request required Treasury approval, as most expenditures did, the file would be sent to the appropriate Treasury Department with a covering letter explaining the Colonial Office's recommendation. The Treasury's response would be filed with the original correspondence, and a reply would be drafted for the Secretary of State's signature. The entire process, from the receipt of the governor's letter to the dispatch of the official reply, typically took 6 to 8 weeks and generated a file containing dozens of documents, all carefully cross-referenced and indexed. For future consultation, this laborious process was repeated thousands of times each year for every aspect of colonial administration. Requests for new appointments required consultation of personnel files and verification of candidates' qualifications. Reports of natural disasters prompted inquiries about relief measures and insurance claims. Disputes between colonial officials generated lengthy correspondence files as each side presented its case and the Colonial Office sought to mediate. Trade regulations required coordination with the Board of Trade and consultation with affected colonies. Military matters involved correspondence with the War Office and the Admiralty. The genius of the system lay not in its efficiency. Few observers would have described Colonial Office procedures as efficient, but in its comprehensiveness. Every decision was documented. Every precedent was recorded. Every policy was explained in detailed correspondence that could be consulted years later when similar issues arose. The filing system developed by the Colonial Office created an institutional PHO and leaves a rich, long-last DYs. My law-last nicey, long-lasting code. Every policy was explained. Y. I tell us how it is X. We is spag with dy. My 7 mide. dy. My second pre-end. My aside. We was daces. By we as I played. We were only school with us. Go at us. We san you sit to ka I sika to s8s I secret ka I slee sits to sacupipat I akakosit I it the I stit to sit and memory that transcended the tenure of individual officials and provided continuity across changes in government and colonial leadership. The importance of this institutional memory became apparent whenever new territories were added to the empire. When Hong Kong was acquired following the First Opium War in 1842, the Colonial Office clerks immediately set to work creating new file categories, new correspondence procedures, and new reporting requirements for the territory. They consulted previous files related to other trading posts and island colonies, adapting existing procedures to Hong Kong's unique circumstances. Within months, the new colony was fully integrated into the Colonial Office's administrative system, with regular correspondence flowing between Government House in Hong Kong and the appropriate department in Downing Street. The Blue Book's annual statistical returns, required from every colonial government, presented the most systematic attempt to standardize information collection across the empire. Beginning in the 1830s, every colonial governor was required to submit detailed annual reports containing standardized data on population, trade, revenue, expenditure, military forces, judicial proceedings, and a host of other administrative matters. These reports were compiled by the Colonial Office's librarian, who spent most of his time preparing parliamentary returns based on the Blue Book data. The preparation of these annual statistical compilations was a monumental task that required months of work by several clerks. Raw data from dozens of territories had to be verified, standardized, and compiled into comprehensive tables that could be presented to Parliament. Discrepancies between reports had to be investigated through correspondence with colonial governments. Missing data had to be estimated or noted as unavailable. And the final compilations had to be cross-checked for accuracy before publication. The Blue Books created an unprecedented database of information about colonial territories. But their real significance lay in their function as an administrative tool. The requirement to submit standardized annual reports forced colonial governments to develop their own bureaucratic systems for collecting and organizing information. Governors who had previously managed their territories through informal consultation and personal networks now had to establish systematic procedures for gathering statistical data, maintaining personnel records, and documenting administrative decisions. This bureaucratic standardization extended to every aspect of colonial administration. The Colonial Office developed standard forms for official appointments, standard procedures for financial reporting, standard formats for correspondence with London. Colonial governments were required to use official seals, follow prescribed protocols for official ceremonies, and maintain prescribed records of their proceedings. The result was a degree of administrative uniformity across the empire that would have been impossible to achieve through direct supervision. Yet, as these 25 civil servants worked quietly in their Downing Street offices, filing correspondence and compiling statistics, a troubling pattern was beginning to emerge. The volume of correspondence was growing steadily each year as the empire expanded and colonial administrations became more complex. The filing systems were becoming increasingly sophisticated, but also increasingly difficult to navigate. The time required to process routine correspondence was lengthening as more precedents had to be consulted, and more departments had to be involved in decision-making. How long could this system continue to expand while maintaining its essential character? And what would happen when the inevitable occurred, when the volume of correspondence finally exceeded the capacity of 25 civil servants to process it systematically? By 1840, the Colonial Office had become the victim of its own success. The systematic approach to correspondence and record-keeping that had made it possible for 25 civil servants to manage a global empire had generated an administrative apparatus that threatened to consume itself through sheer proliferation of documentation. The files that had once fit comfortably in a few cabinets now filled entire rooms. The correspondence that had once been handled by individual clerks now required teams of assistants, and the decisions that had once been made quickly based on established precedents now required extensive research through increasingly voluminous records. The transformation was most visible in the registry, the central nervous system of the Colonial Office's operations. What had begun as a simple system for logging incoming and outgoing correspondence had evolved into a complex bureaucratic machine that employed a growing staff of clerks, assistants, and copyists. The Daily Mail, which had once consisted of a manageable bundle of letters, now arrived in multiple sacks that required several hours to sort and distribute among the appropriate departments. The registrar's daily routine had become an exercise in logistical management that would challenge a modern shipping company. Each morning's correspondence had to be logged in the master registry book, assigned appropriate reference numbers according to an increasingly complex classification system, and distributed to the relevant departments for processing. Urgent correspondence required immediate attention. Routine matters could be processed in the normal course of business, and confidential communications had to be handled according to special security procedures. The classification system itself had grown from a simple alphabetical arrangement to a hierarchical structure that reflected the increasing complexity of colonial affairs. The original 5 departments general, North American, West Indian, Australian, and African and Mediterranean, had been supplemented by a 6th miscellaneous department in 1843. But even this expansion was insufficient to accommodate the growing diversity of imperial responsibilities. Each department maintained its own subclassifications based on territory, subject matter, and priority level, creating a web of cross-references that required specialized knowledge to navigate effectively. The most dramatic example of bureaucratic proliferation was the handling of routine personnel matters. In the 1820s, the appointment of a colonial official might generate a file containing half a dozen documents. The original nomination, a brief biographical summary, the formal appointment, letter, and acknowledgments from the relevant authorities. By the 1840s, the same appointment would produce a file containing dozens of documents, detailed application materials, character references, examination results, medical certificates, financial guarantees, correspondence with multiple government departments, notification letters to affected colonial governments, and follow-up reports on the appointee's performance. This expansion was not the result of deliberate policy, but rather the natural consequence of administrative thoroughness. Each additional document was added to the file for perfectly reasonable administrative purposes to ensure proper vetting of candidates, to maintain accurate personnel records, to provide adequate documentation for future reference. But the cumulative effect was to transform what had once been a relatively simple process into a bureaucratic marathon that could take months to complete. The physical management of the expanding files had become a major challenge. The colonial office's quarters in Downing Street were never designed to accommodate the massive accumulation of documents that the department's systematic approach to record-keeping had generated. Basement storage rooms were converted to file repositories. Unused attics were pressed into service as document warehouses. And clerks found themselves spending significant portions of their time simply locating relevant files in the labyrinthine storage system. The appointment of additional staff to handle the growing workload created its own administrative complications. New clerks had to be trained in the department's complex procedures. Existing staff had to be reorganized to accommodate the newcomers, and supervisory systems had to be developed to ensure consistency in the handling of correspondence. The result was a gradual but steady increase in the colonial office's establishment, though the expansion was never sufficient to keep pace with the growing volume of work. The situation was further complicated by the increasing specialization required to handle colonial affairs effectively. The clerk who had once been able to handle correspondence from multiple territories now found that each colony's affairs had become sufficiently complex to require full-time attention. The Australian department, originally conceived as a single unit, gradually subdivided into separate sections handling New South Wales, Van Diemen's Land, South Australia, and Western Australia, as each colony developed its own distinctive administrative requirements. This specialization improved the quality of administrative decision-making by ensuring that clerks developed detailed knowledge of their assigned territories. But it also created new problems of coordination and consistency. Policies that affected multiple territories required consultation among several departments, increasing the time required for decision-making. Personnel transfers between colonies involved multiple departments, multiplying the paperwork required for routine administrative actions. Trade regulations that affected colonial commerce required coordination with the Board of Trade, the Treasury, and multiple colonial departments. The most significant challenge was posed by the growing volume of routine correspondence that required no substantive decision-making, but nonetheless had to be processed according to established procedures. Acknowledgement letters had to be sent in response to routine reports. Filing copies had to be made of all outgoing correspondence. Statistical summaries had to be prepared for parliamentary inquiries, and cross-references had to be maintained. Between related files, this administrative overhead consumed an increasing proportion of the department's resources without producing any tangible improvement in the quality of colonial governance. The 1837 regulations, rearing colonial governors to submit annual reports, represented both the pinnacle of the colonial office's systematic approach to administration and the beginning of its bureaucratic overextension. The requirement was perfectly logical. Regular reporting would provide London with the information necessary to supervise colonial affairs effectively and ensure consistency in policy implementation across the empire. But the practical effect was to generate an annual avalanche of documentation that strained the department's capacity to the breaking point. Each colonial government's annual Q-Sus Scario report typically ran to several hundred pages and covered every aspect of territorial administration, from judicial proceedings to public works projects. The colonial office's staff had to read these reports carefully, extract relevant information for parliamentary summaries, identify issues requiring follow-up action, and file the documents for future reference. The process consumed months of effort by multiple clerks and generated thousands of pages of additional correspondence as questions arose and clarifications were requested. The irony was that this systematic approach to colonial administration, which had been designed to improve efficiency and consistency, was beginning to produce the opposite effect. Decisions that should have been made quickly were delayed by bureaucratic procedures. Correspondence that should have been handled routinely was subjected to extensive review, and administrative actions that should have been straightforward were complicated by requirements for documentation and cross-referencing. Senior officials in the colonial office were well aware of these problems, but they were trapped by the logic of their own system. Any reduction in documentation requirements might result in less effective oversight of colonial affairs. Any simplification of procedures might create opportunities for errors or inconsistencies. Any decrease in the thoroughness of administrative review might lead to poor decisions that could have serious consequences for colonial governance. The result was a gradual but inexorable expansion of the bureaucratic apparatus. As each new administrative challenge was met by the creation of additional procedures, additional documentation requirements, and additional staff to handle the growing workload, the colonial office was becoming a victim of its own conscientiousness, drowning in the very documentation that had once been the source of its administrative effectiveness. As the 1840s progressed, thoughtful observers began to wonder whether the colonial office's approach to administration was sustainable in the long term. The files were multiplying at an exponential rate, the procedures were becoming increasingly complex, and the time required to process routine correspondence was growing longer each year. Could this system continue to expand indefinitely, or would it eventually reach a point where the administrative machinery became more important than the actual work it was supposed to accomplish? By 1850, the colonial office had achieved something unprecedented in the history of government administration, a bureaucratic system so comprehensive, so systematic, and so thoroughly documented that it could theoretically operate without human judgment. Every conceivable administrative situation had been encountered at least once. Every type of correspondence had been classified and filed. Every policy decision had been documented and cross-referenced with related precedents. The result was an administrative machine of extraordinary sophistication that could process routine colonial business with mechanical precision. The achievement was most evident in the department's handling of routine correspondence, which had been systematized to a degree that would impress modern efficiency experts. A standard gubernatorial dispatch reporting on the colony's quarterly revenue figures would trigger an automatic sequence of administrative actions. Acknowledgement letter dispatched within 48 hours. Relevant figures extracted and forwarded to the Treasury for consolidation with imperial accounts. Statistical summary prepared for inclusion in the next parliamentary return. Filing copy prepared and stored under appropriate cross-references, and follow-up inquiries initiated, if any. Figures appeared inconsistent with previous reports. This entire process could be completed by junior clerks following established procedures without requiring any substantive decision-making by senior officials. The classification system had become so detailed that virtually every type of correspondence could be categorized automatically. The precedent files had become so comprehensive that standard responses could be located for almost any situation. And the cross-referencing system had become so thorough that related cases could be identified and consulted with minimal research. The Colonial Office's librarian had become the keeper of what was arguably the world's most comprehensive database of governmental information. The annual blue books from every colonial territory were systematically analyzed and compiled into statistical summaries that revealed patterns and trends invisible to individual colonial administrators. Trade figures were compiled across territories to identify imperial-wide economic developments. Population statistics were analyzed to plan future administrative requirements. And revenue data were consolidated to assess the fiscal health of individual colonies and the empire as a whole. These statistical compilations served not merely as informational summaries, but as administrative tools for managing imperial affairs. Territories showing declining revenues received increased scrutiny from London. Colonies reporting population growth were prioritized for infrastructure development. And regions experiencing trade disruptions were monitored for potential political instability. The Colonial Office's statistical apparatus had become an early warning system that could identify developing problems before they reached crisis proportions. The sophistication of the bureaucratic machine was perhaps most evident in its handling of personnel administration across the empire. The Colonial Office maintained detailed files on thousands of officials serving in territories around the world, tracking their careers from initial appointment through promotion, transfer, and eventual retirement. These personnel records included not only basic biographical information, but also performance evaluations, disciplinary actions, financial arrangements, and family circumstances that might affect an official's suitability for particular assignments. The system enabled the Colonial Office to manage imperial personnel with unprecedented precision. When a position became vacant in Hong Kong, the relevant clerk could quickly identify suitable candidates serving in other Asian territories who possessed the necessary qualifications and experience. When political tensions in a particular colony required the appointment of officials with specific skills or backgrounds, the personnel files could be searched to identify appropriate candidates. When financial pressures required economies in colonial administration, the files provided detailed information about salary costs and administrative requirements across all territories. This systematic approach to personnel management extended to the most minute details of colonial administration. The Colonial Office maintained standardized job descriptions for every position in colonial service, established uniform salary scales that applied across territories, and developed consistent policies for leave, pension arrangements, and family allowances. The result was a degree of administrative consistency across the empire that made it possible for officials to transfer between widely separated territories with minimal disruption to their careers or the administrative systems they served. The bureaucratic machine's capacity for self-regulation was demonstrated by its handling of the administrative challenges posed by rapid imperial expansion during the 1840s and 1850s, when new territories were acquired whether through military conquest, diplomatic negotiation, or commercial penetration. The Colonial Office could integrate them into the existing administrative system with remarkable speed and efficiency. Standard procedures were adapted to local circumstances. Experienced personnel were transferred from established colonies to provide administrative leadership. and reporting requirements were implemented to ensure consistent oversight from London. The annexation of the Punjab following the Second Sikh War in 1849 provides a striking example of the system's effectiveness. Within months of the territory's incorporation into British India, Scoochie, the Colonial Office, had established communication protocols with the new administration, implemented standard reporting requirements, begun collecting statistical data for inclusion in imperial summaries, and initiated personnel transfers to staff the expanded bureaucracy. The entire process was accomplished through routine administrative procedures without requiring any fundamental changes to the Colonial Office's organizational structure or operational methods. Yet the very perfection of the bureaucratic machine was beginning to create new problems that its designers had not anticipated. The systematic documentation of every administrative action was generating files so voluminous that locating relevant precedents was becoming increasingly difficult. The comprehensive cross-referencing system was producing such complex webs of interconnected cases that clerks spent more time researching precedents than making decisions. The standardized procedures were becoming so detailed and elaborate that even routine correspondence required extensive consultation with multiple sources. The most serious problem was the growing disconnect between the bureaucratic machines, internal logic, and the external realities of colonial administration. The filing system was designed to ensure consistency and prevent errors, but it was becoming so complex that clerks were making mistakes simply because they could not navigate the documentation effectively. The precedent system was intended to provide guidance for decision-making, but it was generating so many competing precedents that choosing among them required precisely the kind of subjective judgment that the system was designed to eliminate. The Colonial Office's correspondence with colonial governors revealed the growing strain. Governors complained that routine requests were taking months to process, that London's responses often failed to address the specific circumstances that had prompted their original inquiries, and that the requirement to conform to standardized procedures was interfering with effective local administration. The bureaucratic machine that had been designed to improve colonial governance was beginning to impede it. Senior Colonial Office officials recognized these problems but found themselves trapped by the internal dynamics of their own system. Any simplification of procedures might result in decreased oversight of colonial affairs. Any reduction in documentation requirements might create opportunities for errors or inconsistencies. Any deviation from established precedents might lead to charges of favoritism or arbitrary decision-making. The bureaucratic machine had become so sophisticated and so comprehensive that it could no longer be modified without risking its fundamental integrity. The ultimate irony was that the Colonial Office's achievement in creating a perfectly systematic approach to colonial administration had made effective administration more difficult rather than easier. The 25 civil servants who had once managed a global empire through careful attention to correspondence and systematic record-keeping had been succeeded by a bureaucratic apparatus so complex and so rigid that it could process information efficiently but could not respond flexibly to changing circumstances. As the 1850s progressed and the empire continued to expand, the fundamental question facing the Colonial Office was whether its bureaucratic machine could evolve to meet new challenges or whether its very perfection had made such evolution impossible. The files continued to multiply, the procedures continued to proliferate, and the correspondence continued to flow through the system with mechanical precision. But whether this constituted effective government or merely the appearance of effective government was becoming increasingly unclear. In the autumn of 1908, 23 young men gathered in the lecture halls of the Imperial Institute in South Kensington for what would prove to be one of the most consequential educational experiments in British history. They were ordinary graduates from ordinary universities, mostly Oxford and Cambridge. with a few from Edinburgh and Dublin who had passed the colonial service examinations and been selected for administrative positions in Britain's African territories. What made their gathering extraordinary was not their academic achievements or social backgrounds, but the simple fact that they were the first generation of colonial administrators to receive formal training before being dispatched to govern territories containing millions of people. The 3-month course they attended was, by any objective measure, woefully inadequate preparation for the responsibilities they would assume. The curriculum covered law, accountancy, tropical hygiene, and tropical resources, practical subjects that reflected the colonial office's belief that imperial administration was essentially a matter of technical competence rather than political sophistication. The instruction was delivered by part-time lecturers who had limited experience in colonial affairs. The facilities were cramped and poorly equipped, and the entire program had the hastily improvised character of an emergency measure rather than a systematic educational initiative. Yet this modest beginning represented a revolutionary departure from the traditional British approach to colonial administration, which had relied on the assumption that a gentleman's education at an English public school and ancient university provided adequate preparation for any administrative challenge the empire might present. For over 2 centuries, Britain had sent young men to govern territories they had never seen, cultures they did not understand, and peoples whose languages they could not speak. Secure in the confidence that character, common sense, and a classical education would prove sufficient for any situation they might encounter, the inadequacy of this approach had become increasingly apparent as the empire expanded into territories that bore little resemblance to the commercial trading posts where the system had originally developed. The conquest of vast territories in tropical Africa during the 1890s had created administrative challenges that could not be addressed through intuition and improvisation alone. Colonial officials found themselves responsible for tax collection systems they did not understand, legal disputes involving customary laws they had never studied, and public health problems for which their education had provided no preparation. The immediate catalyst for the 1908 training program was the simple recognition that Britain's new African territories required far more administrators than the established colonies could provide through the traditional system of promotion from subordinate positions. The rapid expansion of British control across tropical Africa had created hundreds of new administrative posts that had to be filled by men recruited directly from universities, most of whom had no previous experience of colonial service and no practical knowledge of the conditions they would encounter. The curriculum developed for the 1908 course reflected the colonial office's mechanistic understanding of the administrative challenges facing the empire. Law instruction focused on the basic principles of English jurisprudence and their application in colonial contexts, with particular attention to land tenure systems and commercial regulations. Accountancy covered the standardized bookkeeping methods that colonial administrations were required to use in reporting their financial affairs to London. Tropical hygiene provided basic information about disease prevention and public health, measures appropriate to African conditions. The study of tropical resources surveyed the agricultural and mineral potential of different colonial territories and the commercial methods appropriate for their development. Each subject was treated as a discrete body of technical knowledge that could be mastered through systematic study and practical application. The law lectures emphasized the importance of precedent and procedure. The accountancy instruction stressed accuracy and consistency in financial record-keeping. The hygiene presentations focused on proven methods for preventing disease and maintaining health in tropical climates. The underlying assumption was that colonial administration was essentially a matter of applying established techniques to local circumstances, rather than a complex political process requiring cultural sensitivity and adaptive judgment. The students who attended the 1908 course were, for the most part, products of the British educational system that had been refined over centuries to produce administrators for domestic service. They had received classical educations emphasizing Latin and Greek literature, ancient history, and moral philosophy subjects that were considered essential preparation for positions of responsibility and leadership. Their university careers had focused on the study of mathematics, classics, or modern history, with little attention to practical subjects like economics, anthropology, or foreign languages. This educational background had served the empire well in territories where British administration operated primarily through established commercial networks and existing political structures. In India, where the East India Company had developed sophisticated bureaucratic systems over centuries of operation, or in the Caribbean, where plantation agriculture had created stable economic and social patterns. The traditional British emphasis on character and general intelligence had proved adequate for most administrative challenges, but the new African territories presented fundamentally different challenges that could not be addressed through the application of precedent and the exercise of gentlemanly common sense. Colonial officials found themselves responsible for populations that had never been subjected to systematic taxation, legal systems that bore no resemblance to English law, and economic activities that operated according to principles that had never been studied in British universities. The traditional approach of learning through trial and error was proving both inefficient and dangerous in territories where administrative mistakes could trigger widespread unrest. The 3-month course was designed to address these problems by providing colonial administrators with practical knowledge relevant to their specific responsibilities. But the brevity of the program and the limited expertise of the instructional staff meant that the training remained superficial and theoretical. Students learned about the legal principles governing land tenure in tropical Africa, but they received no instruction in the practical methods for investigating customary land rights or mediating disputes between competing claimants. They studied the bookkeeping procedures required for colonial financial administration, but they were given no preparation for the challenge of imposing systematic taxation on populations that had never participated in a cash economy. The hygiene instruction, which occupied a substantial portion of the curriculum, reflected the colonial office's recognition that the high mortality rates among European administrators in tropical territories posed a serious threat to the effectiveness of imperial governance. Students learned about water purification, mosquito control, and dietary practices that could reduce their risk of contracting malaria, yellow fever, and other tropical diseases. But even this practical instruction was limited by the primitive state of medical knowledge about tropical diseases and the absence of effective preventive measures for most of the health problems they would encounter. The study of tropical resources was perhaps the most optimistic component of the curriculum, reflecting the widespread belief that Britain's new African territories possessed vast untapped wealth that could be developed through the application of modern commercial methods. Students learned about the potential for agricultural development, mineral exploration, and commercial infrastructure that could transform subsistence economies into productive components of the imperial trading system. But this instruction was almost entirely theoretical, based on limited and often inaccurate information about local conditions and unrealistic assumptions about the ease with which traditional economic systems could be modified. Despite its limitations, the 1908 course represented a significant step toward the professionalization of colonial administration. For the first time, the Colonial Office had acknowledged that imperial governance required specialized knowledge and systematic preparation rather than simply relying on the character and intelligence of individual administrators. The course established the principle that colonial service was a professional career requiring specific training and qualifications, rather than merely an opportunity for adventurous young gentlemen to seek their fortunes in exotic locations. But as the first class of trained administrators departed for their assignments in Nigeria, Kenya, and the Gold Coast. Fundamental questions remained about the adequacy of their preparation for the challenges they would face. Could 3 months of theoretical instruction provide sufficient foundation for governing territories that had never been systematically studied? And what would happen when these carefully trained administrators encountered situations for which their textbooks had provided no guidance? The reports that began arriving in London from the first generation of formally trained colonial administrators were both encouraging and troubling. The men who had completed the 1908 course were demonstrably more effective than their pros, more effective than their untrained predecessors in handling routine administrative tasks. They maintained better financial records, followed more systematic procedures for tax collection, and implemented public health measures with greater consistency. But they were also encountering problems for which their 3 months of theoretical instruction had provided no preparation, and their requests for guidance were revealing the fundamental inadequacy of the Colonial Office's understanding of local conditions in Britain's new territories. The experience convinced Colonial Office officials that systematic training was essential for effective colonial administration, but it also demonstrated that the original program was far too limited in scope and duration. The challenge was to develop a more comprehensive approach to professional preparation without abandoning the fundamental principle that colonial administrators should be generalists capable of handling diverse responsibilities rather than narrow specialists with expertise in particular subjects. The solution that emerged during the 1920s represented a compromise between the demand for specialized knowledge and the traditional British preference for broad-based education. Under the dynamic leadership of R.D. Firth, the Colonial Office developed separate training programs for each branch of colonial service, recognizing that the knowledge and skills required for medical administration, agricultural development, forest management, and general administration were sufficiently different to require specialized preparation. The diversification of training programs reflected the increasing complexity of colonial administration, as territories that had been conquered primarily for strategic reasons were developed into economically productive components of the imperial system. Medical officers underwent 6 months of intensive training at the London, Liverpool, or Edinburgh School of Tropical Medicine, focusing on the diagnosis and treatment of diseases that were rare or unknown in Europe. Forest officers completed a 1-year probationship at the Imperial Forestry Institute at Oxford, studying the scientific principles of forest management and their application to tropical timber resources. Agricultural probationers received a year's postgraduate scholarship in the United Kingdom, followed by 9 months of practical training at the Imperial College of Tropical Agriculture in Trinidad. Each specialized program was designed to provide systematic preparation for the specific challenges that officers would encounter in their professional careers. Medical training emphasized the practical skills needed to establish public health systems in territories with limited infrastructure and trained personnel. Forestry instruction focused on the conservation and development of timber resources that were becoming increasingly valuable as global demand for tropical wood products expanded. Agricultural education covered both the scientific principles of tropical farming and the practical methods for introducing new crops and farming techniques. 2 traditional agricultural societies. The most ambitious training program was developed for the Colonial Administrative Service, CAS, which had evolved from the earlier tropical African administrative services to encompass all territories under direct colonial office control. First, was determined to raise the CAS to the level of the prestigious Indian Civil Service, which had long been considered the elite branch of British imperial administration. This required not only more comprehensive training, but also the establishment of systematic career development and promotion procedures that would attract the highest quality university graduates. The CAS training program, established in 1926, represented a dramatic expansion of the Colonial Office's commitment to professional preparation. Instead of the 3-month course that had sufficed in 1908, CAS probationers were required to complete a full year of instruction at Oxford, Cambridge, or the London School of Economics. The curriculum covered field engineering, tropical hygiene, natural resources, anthropology, law, languages, and British colonial history. A comprehensive program that attempted to provide both practical skills and theoretical understanding of the challenges facing colonial administrators. The inclusion of anthropology in the curriculum reflected a growing recognition that effective colonial plots administration required understanding of local cultures and social systems rather than simply the imposition of British methods and procedures. Students learned about kinship systems, religious practices, economic relationships, and political structures that governed the societies they would be expected to administer. This represented a significant departure from the earlier assumption that colonial peoples could be governed through the straightforward application of British law and administrative procedures. Language instruction was another innovation that acknowledged the practical reality that administrators could not function effectively without the ability to communicate with the populations they governed. Students were required to achieve basic competency in the languages most commonly used in their assigned territories, though the brevity of the training period meant that most achieved only elementary conversational ability rather than the fluency required for sophisticated administrative or legal work. The expansion of training programs was accompanied by systematic efforts to improve the selection of candidates for colonial service. The Colonial Office developed more rigorous examination procedures, established medical and psychological screening requirements, and implemented probationary periods that allowed for the elimination of unsuitable candidates before they were given permanent appointments. The goal was to ensure that only the most capable and suitable individuals were appointed to positions of administrative responsibility in the colonies. The new selection procedures reflected a more sophisticated understanding of the personal qualities required for effective colonial service. Academic achievement remained important, but greater attention was paid to practical intelligence, adaptability, physical stamina, and psychological stability. Candidates were evaluated not only on their knowledge of relevant subjects, but also on their ability to work independently, their capacity for dealing with stress and isolation, and their potential for learning new skills and adapting to unfamiliar circumstances. The most innovative aspect of the expanded training system was the development of specialized programs for officers already serving in the colonies. The Colonial Office recognized that initial training, however comprehensive, could not fully prepare administrators for all the challenges they would encounter during their careers. Periodic refresher courses, sabbatical programs, and advanced training opportunities were established to ensure that colonial officers could continue to develop their professional skills and knowledge throughout their careers. These mid-career training programs served multiple purposes beyond simple professional development. They provided opportunities for experienced officers to share knowledge and best practices developed in different territories. They facilitated the development of consistent policies and procedures across the colonial system, and they helped to maintain morale and motivation among officers serving in isolated and challenging circumstances. The expansion of colonial service training during the 1920s represented a remarkable achievement in the development of professional public administration. Within 2 decades, the Colonial Office had transformed colonial service from an occupation that required no systematic preparation into a professional career with comprehensive training requirements, standardized procedures, and systematic career development opportunities. The result was a dramatic improvement in the quality and effectiveness of colonial administration across the realm. But the success of the training programs also created new challenges and expectations that the Colonial Office had not fully anticipated. The professionally trained administrators who emerged from the expanded programs were more knowledgeable and competent than their predecessors. But they were also more demanding in their expectations of career development, more critical of traditional administrative methods, and more insistent on the resources and support they needed to perform their duties effectively. The tension between professional competence and administrative constraint was becoming increasingly apparent as the trained administrators encountered the practical realities of colonial service. Their systematic education had prepared them to implement comprehensive development programs. But colonial budgets remained severely limited. Their professional training had emphasized the importance of systematic planning and consistent policies. But local circumstances often required immediate improvisation and flexible responses. Their academic preparation had stressed the value of evidence-based decision-making. But the information needed for such decisions was often unavailable or unreliable. As the 1930s approached, the fundamental question facing the colonial office was whether the professionally trained colonial service it had created could function effectively within the financial and political constraints that continued to limit imperial administration. The investment in systematic training had produced a generation of capable and knowledgeable administrators. But could they accomplish more with limited resources than their untrained predecessors had achieved through improvisation and common sense? The Second World War marked the end of the old colonial world and the beginning of a new era that would require fundamentally different approaches to imperial administration. The conflict had demonstrated both the military and economic value of the colonial territories and the political dangers of continuing to govern them through traditional methods that had changed little since the 19th century. The war had also produced a generation of colonial administrators whose experiences in military service had given them new perspectives on organization, planning, and the systematic application of resources to achieve specific objectives. The post-war training programs developed by the Colonial Office represented the culmination of 4 decades of evolutionary change in the preparation of imperial administrators. The Devonshire courses, established in 1946 and named after the Colonial Office building where they were initially housed, embodied a revolutionary approach to professional education that sought to combine systematic academic instruction with practical field experience in a comprehensive program that could produce administrators capable of guiding colonial territories through the complex process of political and economic development. The centerpiece of the new system was Course A, a 3-stage sandwich program that alternated periods of university study with field experience in ways that had never been attempted in government service. New recruits began with an intensive year of academic instruction at Oxford, Cambridge, or other approved universities, followed by 18 months of supervised field experience in their assigned territories, and concluded with a final year of advanced study that allowed them to analyze their field experience in light of theoretical knowledge gained through systematic academic work. This innovative structure reflected a sophisticated understanding of the learning process that recognized the limitations of both purely theoretical and purely practical approaches to professional education. The initial academic year provided students with systematic knowledge of the historical, political, economic, and social context of colonial administration. But this theoretical foundation was deliberately incomplete, designed to prepare students to learn from field experience rather than to provide ready-made solutions to administrative problems they would encounter. The field experience component, of course, A was carefully structured to provide systematic exposure to different aspects of colonial administration rather than simply throwing new recruits into routine duties and hoping they would learn through trial and error. Students were assigned to experienced administrators who served as mentors and supervisors, ensuring that field experience was genuinely educational rather than merely practical. They rotated through different departments and functions, gaining first-hand knowledge of revenue collection, judicial administration, public works, agricultural extension, and other specialized aspects of territorial governance. The final academic year allowed students to synthesize their field experience with theoretical knowledge in ways that produced genuine professional expertise rather than merely practical competence. Students wrote detailed analyses of specific administrative problems they had encountered, comparing different approaches to similar challenges and developing recommendations for improved policies and procedures. The result was a generation of administrators who possessed both systematic knowledge of colonial administration and practical experience in applying that knowledge to real-world problems. Course, he represented an equally innovative approach to mid-career professional development. This one-year sabbatical program was open to both administrative and departmental officers who had completed at least 7 years of colonial service and demonstrated exceptional competence in their professional duties. The program provided opportunities for experienced officers to undertake advanced study in specialized subjects relevant to their career development, to conduct research on specific problems facing their territories, and to interact with colleagues from other parts of the colonial system. The selection process for the Devonshire courses reflected the post-war recognition that colonial service was entering a new phase that would require different qualities and capabilities than had sufficed during the era of simple administrative control. Academic achievement remained important, but greater emphasis was placed on creative intelligence, adaptability, leadership potential, and the capacity for understanding complex social and political processes. Candidates were evaluated through intensive interviews, psychological assessments, and practical exercises that tested their ability to analyze problems, develop solutions, and communicate effectively with people from different cultural backgrounds. The curriculum of the academic components had been expanded to include subjects that reflected the changing nature of colonial administration in the post-war world. Economic development, public administration, social welfare, educational policy, and political science were given equal attention with the traditional subjects of law, anthropology, and tropical hygiene. Students studied contemporary theories of development and modernization, examined case studies of successful and unsuccessful administrative interventions, and analyzed the political and social changes that were transforming colonial societies throughout the world. The most significant innovation was the systematic attention given to the political dimensions of colonial administration. Earlier training programs had focused primarily on technical and administrative competence, reflecting the assumption that colonial territories would remain under British control indefinitely, and that the primary challenge facing administrators was the maintenance of order and the economic development within established political frameworks. The post-war programs recognized that political change was inevitable and that colonial administrators would need to guide territories through processes of constitutional development that would eventually lead to self-government and independence. This recognition transformed the entire approach to colonial service training. Students learned not only how to administer existing systems, but also how to modify and adapt those systems to accommodate changing political circumstances. They studied methods of constitutional development, techniques of political consultation and negotiation, and strategies for managing the transition from direct administrative control to advisory and cooperative relationships with indigenous political leaders. The practical results of the Devonshire courses were evident in the quality of colonial administration during the 1950s and 1960s, as Britain guided most of its remaining territories through the process of decolonization. The administrators produced by the post-war training programs demonstrated remarkable skill and adaptability in managing complex political transitions, negotiating constitutional settlements, and establishing institutional frameworks that could function effectively after independence. Their systematic education had prepared them not only to administer colonial territories, but also to assist in the creation of new nation-states. Yet the very success of the Devonshire courses highlighted the fundamental contradiction that had always existed at the heart of the colonial service training system. The programs had been designed to produce more effective imperial administrators, but the skills and knowledge they provided were equally valuable for the leaders of independent nations who would replace British officials after decolonization. The colonial office had inadvertently created a system that prepared people to liquidate the empire with the same systematic efficiency that had once been applied to its state administration. The final irony of the colonial service training system was that its most important legacy was not the improvement of imperial administration, but the contribution it made to the peaceful transition from colonial rule to independence. The administrators produced by the Devonshire courses played crucial roles in establishing the constitutional, legal, and administrative foundations of the new nations that emerged from the British Empire during the 1950s and 1960s. Their systematic education in the principles of public administration, their practical experience in managing complex governmental operations, and their understanding of the political processes involved in constitutional development proved invaluable during the challenging period of declo and as the empire dissolved and the colonial office prepared for its own abolition. The training programs that had been designed to perpetuate British rule had instead facilitated its orderly termination. The young men who had once been prepared to spend their careers administering distant territories on behalf of the crown found themselves instead helping to create the institutional foundations of independent nations. The bureaucratic revolution that had begun with 23 students in South Kensington in 1908 had culminated 60 years later in the systematic dismantling of the imperial system it had been created to serve. In the basement of the Colonial Office building in London, during the summer of 1947, a small team of civil servants worked with quiet determination on what would prove to be one of the most complex administrative exercises in British history. Their task was not the expansion of empire or the creation of new territories, but rather the systematic dismantling of political structures that had taken centuries to construct. They were preparing the paperwork for the independence of India, process that would require the creation of entirely new governmental systems. The division of assets and liabilities accumulated over generations of imperial rule, and the establishment of administrative procedures for managing the transition from colonial dependency to sovereign nationhood. The challenge they faced was unprecedented in its scope and complexity. Unlike previous grants of independence to small territories with relatively simple governmental structures, the partition of British India involved the creation of two separate nation-states from a unified administrative system that governed over 400 million people across a subcontinent. Every aspect of imperial administration, from the division of military forces to the allocation of postal stamps, had to be systematically addressed through formal agreements, legal documents, and administrative procedures that could withstand scrutiny by parliaments, courts, and international organizations. The Mountbatten Plan, announced on June 3, 1947, provided the political framework for partition, but the implementation of independence required the preparation of hundreds of technical agreements covering every conceivable aspect of governmental operation. These documents, prepared by teams of lawyers, accountants, and administrative specialists working in temporary offices scattered throughout Whitehall, determine how the assets and responsibilities of the British Raj would be divided between India and Pakistan, how ongoing governmental functions would be maintained during the transition period, and how disputes arising from partition would be resolved. The magnitude of the administrative challenge was evident in the simple matter of governmental records. The British administration in India had maintained meticulous documentation for over a century, creating files that filled entire buildings in New Delhi, Calcutta, Bombay, and dozens of smaller administrative centers. These records contained the institutional memory of imperial governance, land revenue assessments, judicial precedents, personnel files, financial accounts, and policy correspondence that would be essential for the effective functioning of any successor government. But which records should go to India, which to Pakistan, and which should be retained by Britain as part of its own historical archives? The solution developed by the Colonial Office represented the same systematic approach to administration that had characterized British imperial governance for centuries. Special committees were established to inventory all governmental records, classify them according to their relevance to different aspects of administration, and develop criteria for their allocation between the successor states. Forms were created for cataloging individual files. Procedures were established for copying documents that both governments needed to retain. And schedules were developed for the physical transfer of records from British custody to their new repositories. This bureaucratic approach to decolonization extended to every aspect of the transition process. The division of military forces required detailed inventories of equipment, supplies, and facilities, followed by complex negotiations over the allocation of assets between the Indian and Pakistani armies. The partition of financial assets and liabilities involved comprehensive audits of governmental accounts, the calculation of each territory's contribution to imperial expenses, and the development of formulas for sharing ongoing obligations such as pension payments to retired civil servants. The most complex challenge was the division of the Indian civil service itself. The elite administrative corps that had governed the subcontinent for generations and represented one of Britain's most significant contributions to the art of public administration. The ICS included both British and Indian officers, some of whom wished to continue serving the successor governments, while others preferred to return to Britain or transfer to other parts of the colonial service. Each individual case required careful consideration of the officers' preferences, the needs of the successor governments, and the financial implications of different arrangements for pension payments and compensation. The bureaucratic machinery developed to handle these complex negotiations represented a remarkable achievement in administrative organization. Separate committees were established to handle different aspects of partition military affairs: financial arrangements, civil service personnel, governmental records, and physical assets. Each committee maintained detailed files documenting their proceedings, prepared regular reports for senior officials, and developed standardized procedures for resolving the disputes that inevitably arose during the negotiation process. The attention to administrative detail that characterized the partition process reflected not only the British commitment to systematic governance, but also the recognition that poorly managed decolonization could create serious problems for both the successor states and Britain itself. The Irish independence negotiations following World War I had demonstrated the dangers of inadequate preparation for the transfer of power, while the mandate system established after the war had shown the importance of clear legal frameworks for managing transitions from one form of government to another. The colonial office's approach to Indian independence established precedents and procedures that would be applied to subsequent decolonization processes throughout the British Empire. The forms developed for inventory and governmental assets were adapted for use in other territories. The procedures established for dividing financial obligations were modified to suit different circumstances, and the administrative systems created for managing personnel transitions were refined based on experience gained during the Indian partition. But the bureaucratic precision that characterized the preparation for Indian independence could not address the human dimensions of partition that would ultimately determine its success or failure. While civil servants in London worked methodically through inventories of governmental property and calculations of financial obligations, the actual process of creating new national boundaries was generating massive population displacements, communal violence, and social disruption that no amount of administrative planning could prevent or control. The reports that began arriving in London during the autumn of 1947 revealed the gulf between bureaucratic theory and political reality that would characterize much of the decolonization process. The carefully prepared procedures for transferring governmental functions had worked reasonably well in major administrative centers where British officials could supervise the transition process directly. but in remote districts where single administrative officers were responsible for territories containing hundreds of thousands of people. The systematic transfer of authority envisioned by the colonial office planners had broken down completely. The experience of Indian partition forced colonial office officials to confront fundamental questions about the relationship between administrative competence and political success that would influence their approach to subsequent decolonization processes. Could systematic preparation and careful documentation ensure smooth transitions to independence? Or were there aspects of political change that were inherently beyond the control of administrative planning? And if bureaucratic methods were insufficient? To manage decolonization, what alternative approaches might prove more effective? These questions became increasingly urgent as nationalist movements in other parts of the empire began demanding independence, and colonial office officials realized that Indian partition was not an isolated event, but rather the beginning of a systematic process that would eventually encompass most of Britain's remaining colonial territories. The bureaucratic machinery that had been created for managing the Indian transition would need to be adapted and refined to handle dozens of similar processes over the following 2 decades. As the files documenting Indian partition were sorted, indexed, and filed in the colonial office's expanding archives, senior officials began planning for the administrative challenges that future independence negotiations would present. But the complexity and scale of the Indian experience had raised troubling questions about whether even the most systematic bureaucratic approach could manage the political and social forces that decolonization had unleashed. By 1957, when Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to achieve independence, the colonial office had transformed decolonization from a unique political crisis requiring improvised solutions into a standardized administrative process governed by established procedures, forms, and precedents. The experience gained from Indian partition and the independence of Ceylon, Burma, and Malaya had been systematically analyzed, documented, and incorporated into a comprehensive framework for managing the transfer of power that could be adapted to different territories and circumstances. The creation of this bureaucratic system for dismantling the Rusi Empire represented one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of public administration. Colonial office officials had succeeded in reducing the complex political process of decolonization to a series of manageable administrative tasks that could be handled by teams of specialists working according to established procedures. The result was a degree of consistency and efficiency in the independence process that contrasted sharply with the chaotic and often violent decolonization experiences of other European empires. The foundation of the standardized system was the Colonial Office's Independence Manual, a comprehensive guide that had been developed based on experience gained from previous independence negotiations. The manual covered every aspect of the transfer of power from the initial constitutional discussions through the final ceremonies marking the end of colonial status. It included standardized forms for documenting agreements, templates for constitutional documents, procedures for dividing governmental assets, and guidelines for managing the transition period between the decision to grant independence and its formal implementation. The administrative efficiency of the standardized system was most evident in the handling of constitutional negotiations, which had been reduced to a predictable sequence of consultations, conferences, and agreements. The process typically began with informal discussions between colonial office officials and local political leaders about the timing and conditions for independence. These preliminary conversations were documented according to established procedures and provided the basis for formal constitutional conferences in London where the detailed terms of independence would be negotiated. The constitutional conferences themselves followed carefully planned agendas that ensured all relevant issues were addressed systematically. Separate working groups dealt with different aspects of the independence process: constitutional arrangements, financial settlements, defense agreements, and administrative transitions. Each working group operated according to standardized procedures. maintained detailed records of their deliberations, and prepared comprehensive reports that were incorporated into the final independence agreements. The standardization extended to the most technical aspects of the independence process. The Colonial Office had developed standard formulas for calculating each territory's share of imperial assets and liabilities, template agreements for post-independence economic relationships, and model constitutions that could be adapted to local circumstances. These standardized documents significantly reduced the time required for independence negotiations, while ensuring that all territories received comparable treatment and that no important issues were overlooked during the transition process. The systematic approach to decolonization was perhaps most evident in the Colonial Office's handling of personnel transitions. The experience of Indian partition had demonstrated the importance of careful planning for the future of colonial civil servants, both British and local, who would be affected by independence. The Colonial Office had developed comprehensive procedures for managing these transitions, including standardized compensation packages for British officers who wished to leave colonial service, systematic programs for training local officers to assume senior administrative responsibilities, and detailed arrangements for pension payments and other long-term obligations. The personnel transition procedures were administered by specialized units within the Colonial Office that maintained detailed files on every officer serving in territories approaching independence. These files contained not only basic biographical and career information, but also assessments of each officer's preferences regarding their future career, their suitability for service with successor governments, and the financial implications of different arrangements for their transition out of colonial service. The administrative machinery for managing personnel transitions represented a remarkable example of bureaucratic efficiency applied to human resource management on a global scale. As each territory approached independence, teams of specialists would review the files of all affected personnel, prepare individual transition plans based on established criteria and procedures, and implement these plans according to carefully coordinated schedules that ensured continuity of essential governmental functions throughout the independence process. The standardization of decolonization procedures extended to the ceremonial aspects of independence that were considered essential for establishing the legitimacy and dignity of new nation-states. The Colonial Office had developed detailed protocols for independence ceremonies, including guidelines for the design of new national symbols, procedures for the transfer of governmental authority, and arrangements for international recognition of new states. These protocols ensured that each independence celebration followed similar patterns, while allowing for local variations that reflected the unique characteristics of individual territories. The efficiency of the standardized system was demonstrated by the accelerating pace of decolonization during the late 1960s. The Colonial Office was able to manage multiple independence processes simultaneously, with different territories at various stages of the transition process at any given time. The same teams of specialists who were negotiating constitutional arrangements for one territory might simultaneously be preparing financial settlement agreements for another and implementing personnel transition plans for a third. This systematic approach to decolonization was facilitated by the Colonial Office's development of specialized expertise in the various technical aspects of independence negotiations. Teams of lawyers became expert in constitutional drafting and the legal complexities of transferring sovereignty. Financial specialists developed sophisticated methods for calculating asset divisions and negotiating post-independence economic relationships. Personnel administrators created comprehensive systems for managing the career transitions of thousands of civil servants across dozens of territories. The standardization of independence procedures also created opportunities for learning and improvement based on experience gained from each decolonization process. The Colonial Office maintained detailed files documenting the outcomes of different approaches to various problems, analyzed the effectiveness of different procedures and policies, and continuously refined their methods based on lessons learned from previous cases. This systematic approach to institutional learning enabled the Colonial Office to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of decolonization over time. The success of the standardized system was evident in the relative smoothness of most independence transitions during the 1960s, particularly when compared to the violent and chaotic decolonization processes experienced by other European colonial powers. The careful preparation, systematic negotiation, and orderly transfer of authority that characterized British decolonization helped to ensure that most former colonies achieved independence with functioning governmental institutions, stable constitutional arrangements, and cooperative relationships with their former colonial power. But the very efficiency of the standardized system also created new problems that the Colonial Office had not fully anticipated. The systematic approach to decolonization had been designed to ensure orderly transitions, but it could not address the underlying political and economic challenges that would face new nation-states after independence. The constitutional documents, financial agreements, and administrative arrangements that had been so carefully negotiated often proved inadequate to the complex realities of post-independence governance. As the 1960s progressed and an increasing number of former colonies experienced political instability, economic difficulties, and social conflict, questions began to arise about whether the Colonial Office's systematic approach to decolonization had adequately prepared new states for the challenges of independence. The bureaucratic precision that had ensured smooth transfers of power could not guarantee effective governance after the transfer was complete. On July 1, 1997, in the ballroom of the Hong Kong Convention Center, Governor Chris Patten delivered the final speech of British colonial administration and formally transferred sovereignty of Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China. The ceremony, broadcast live to audiences around the world, marked not only the end of British rule in Hong Kong, but also the conclusion of a process of decolonization that had begun exactly 50 years earlier with the independence of India and Pakistan. As the Union Jack was lowered for the last time over a British colony, it brought to a close an imperial experiment that had shaped the political development of much of the world for over 3 centuries. But the real story of decolonization's conclusion was not the dramatic ceremonies and emotional speeches that captured public attention, but rather the methodical, bureaucratic process that had been unfolding in government offices in London and Hong Kong for months before the handover. Teams of civil servants had been working systematically through the same types of administrative procedures that had characterized every independence process since 1947, inventorying governmental assets, preparing personnel transition plans, negotiating the division of financial obligations, and ensuring the orderly transfer of administrative records and institutional memory. The Hong Kong handover represented the culmination of the Colonial Office's systematic approach to decolonization, refined through 50 years of experience and applied to what was arguably the most complex independence process the British Empire had ever undertaken. Unlike previous decolonizations, which had involved the creation of new nation-states, Hong Kong was being transferred to an existing government with well-established political and administrative systems. This created unique challenges that required modifications to the standard independence procedures that had been developed over the previous 5 decades. The bureaucratic complexity of the Hong Kong transition was evident in the sheer volume of documentation required to formalize the transfer of sovereignty. The joint declaration signed by Britain and China in 1984 had provided the political framework for the handover, but its implementation required hundreds of detailed agreements covering every aspect of governmental operation. These technical agreements, negotiated by joint working groups over more than a decade, addressed issues ranging from the future of Hong Kong's legal system to the disposition of government property. From the continuity of international agreements to the management of the civil service transition, the systematic documentation of the handover process reflected the same attention to administrative detail that had characterized British colonial governance throughout its history. Every aspect of the transition was carefully planned, thoroughly documented, and implemented according to precise schedules designed to ensure continuity of essential governmental functions. The result was a transfer of sovereignty that proceeded with the mechanical precision of a well-designed bureaucratic process. Despite the enormous political and emotional significance of the event, the personnel transitions involved in the Hong Kong handover illustrated both the strengths and limitations of the bureaucratic approach to decolonization. The Colonial Office had developed comprehensive procedures for managing the career transitions of civil servants affected by independence, and these procedures were applied systematically to the thousands of government employees in Hong Kong. British expatriate officers were offered generous compensation packages if they chose to leave government service. Local officers were provided with guarantees of job security under the new administration, and detailed arrangements were made for the transfer of pension rights and other employment benefits. These systematic personnel arrangements ensured that the Hong Kong government could continue functioning effectively throughout the transition period and beyond. But they could not address the psychological and cultural challenges that many civil servants faced as they adapted to serving a new political system with different values and expectations. The bureaucratic precision that had made the administrative transition possible could not eliminate the human uncertainties and anxieties that accompanied such a fundamental political change. The transfer of governmental records and archives represented one of the most complex aspects of the Hong Kong handover and illustrated the central role that documentation had played throughout the history of British imperial administration. The colonial government in Hong Kong had maintained comprehensive records for over 150 years, creating an archive that contained the institutional memory of British rule and would be essential for the effective functioning of any successor administration. But the division of these records between Britain and China required complex negotiations about which documents were relevant to ongoing governmental functions and which had primarily historical significance. The solution developed for the Hong Kong handover reflected the same systematic approach that had been applied to similar problems. During previous decolonization processes, joint committees were established to inventory all governmental records, classify them according to their relevance to different aspects of administration, and develop criteria for determining which documents should remain in Hong Kong and which should be transferred to Britain. The process took several years to complete and required the cataloging of millions of individual documents, but it ensured that both governments would have access to the records they needed while preserving the historical integrity of the colonial. Archived the financial settlement arrangements for Hong Kong demonstrated how the colonial office's standardized approach to independence negotiations had evolved over 50 years of experience. Unlike earlier decolonizations, which had often involved complex calculations about each territory's contribution to imperial expenses and its share of imperial assets, the Hong Kong handover was simplified by the fact that the territory was being transferred to an existing government rather than becoming an independent state. This eliminated many of the financial complications that had characterized previous independence processes. But it also required new types of agreements about the continuity of Hong Kong's economic relationships and financial obligations. The ceremonial aspects of the Hong Kong handover reflected the same attention to protocol and procedure that had characterized British decolonization throughout the post-war period. The Colonial Office had developed detailed guidelines for independence ceremonies over decades of experience, and these were adapted to suit the unique circumstances of the Hong Kong transition. The result was a ceremony that combined the dignity and formality appropriate to such a historic occasion with the practical efficiency that had characterized British colonial administration throughout its history. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the Hong Kong handover was what it revealed about the ultimate legacy of the British approach to decolonization. The systematic procedures, careful documentation, and orderly transitions that had characterized British decolonization had succeeded in creating a process that was remarkably efficient and peaceful. Compared to the experiences of other colonial powers, the great majority of former British colonies had achieved independence without the violent conflicts and institutional breakdowns that had accompanied decolonization elsewhere. Yet the bureaucratic success of British decolonization had not necessarily translated into political success for the new nation-states that emerged from the process. Many former colonies had experienced political instability, economic difficulties, and social conflicts that the careful constitutional arrangements and systematic transition procedures had been unable to prevent. The administrative competence that had made decolonization so orderly could not guarantee effective governance after independence was achieved. The final irony of the British approach to decolonization was that its very efficiency may have contributed to some of the problems that former colonies experienced after independence. The systematic procedures that had made transition so smooth had also tended to create constitutional and administrative arrangements that reflected British assumptions about effective governance rather than local conditions and preferences. The standardized approach that had made it possible to manage multiple independence processes simultaneously had sometimes produced institutional arrangements that were inappropriate for the specific circumstances of individual territories. As the last boxes of files were packed and shipped from Government House in Hong Kong to their new repositories in London and Beijing, they represented the end of one of the most comprehensive experiments in systematic administration that the world had ever seen. The British Empire had been built through careful attention to bureaucratic detail, and it had been dismantled with the same methodical precision that had characterized its construction. Whether this represented the triumph of rational administration over political chaos or the limitation of bureaucratic thinking when applied to complex human problems, remained an open question that historians would continue to debate long after the last colonial file had been properly indexed and filed away. This concludes the 4 stories of the entire story of the British Empire. From the methodical record-keeping that built the East India Company's administrative machine, through the filing systems that allowed 25 civil servants to manage a quarter of the world, to the systematic training that created professional colonial administrators, and finally to the bureaucratic precision that dismantled the empire with the same care that had been used to construct it. Each story reveals how the most boring aspects of administration, forms, files, training manuals, and transfer documents were ultimately the foundation upon which the largest empire in human history was built, and eventually, systematically dissolved.